So we've done that. And now I want to talk about what is culture? And it refers to the collective beliefs, values, customs, and practices that characterize a particular group or society. And that definition actually comes from UNESCO. You can find it there. So culture encompasses language, art, religion, and social norms. And it shapes how individuals interact with one another and perceive the world. And I think this last part becomes very important in a team coaching context, shaping how individuals act with one another. Um, this sounds very familiar, right? When you're working with a team, that, and especially a cross-cultural team. So I think that most people, when they hear this word culture, they're thinking of it in terms of national or ethnic or racial identity. And that's actually very important as we're working with teams, especially ones that are cross-culture, cross-cultural teams and global teams. But as we know, culture is a multi-level construct. Culture also shows up at regional levels, like the Nordics or the Deep South in America, urban versus city culture. Religion is often defined as a culture. Again, my coming from America, and I grew up in the Detroit area, and this specific area I grew up in was actually extremely Jewish. There's a lot of Jewish people there. So I was kind of, um, raised as a Christian in this, immersed in Jewish culture. So I started enjoying, Jewish foods. There's foods that are eaten during Passover in America. Um, it shows up describing entire professional cultures, like, for example, very oversimplifying here, but blue collar or academic culture. Um, Socioeconomics, there's culture attached to that. Biggest example I'm coming to mind right now is working class. There's culture there versus affluent culture. Um, every organization and every company has its own culture, and every group or team within the organization has its own sort of microculture on top of the organizational culture. So culture is a very complex, multi-level construct. But today I'm going to reduce some of that complexity a bit and look at more of this national and team culture. But I think it's important for us as team coaches to understand how all these various levels of culture impact people's values, people's behaviors, people's expectations of what professional means, what appropriate behavior is at work. And I know these can be quite loaded terms in a lot of sense. However, we do have schemas that we are cultured into. If you know this topic of schemas from like psychology research, culture is a schema. It's a way for us to very quickly understand the world. So why does it matter in team dynamics? And I mean, it's pretty obvious that it directly affects communication, decisions, trust, and collaboration. And these are all the magical things that we need for good teamwork. And I do want to point out that a team may be culturally diverse. And I see this, when I've been working with culture in the teams I've worked with, they all have identified, oh yeah, we're a diverse team, and that's our strength. Um, and we know it's from studies that is proven to be a strength in creativity and innovation to have a diverse team. But that strength can only be taken advantage of when the team is engaging with that diversity on an intentional level and they're having open and honest conversations. And to do that, it takes cultural intelligence. Now, that's a word we're hearing a lot of lately too. So, cultural intelligence is often shown as CQ, is the ability to effectively understand, adapt, and work in different cultural contexts. And why this is important is um, when I was doing research into doing this presentation and working with also, these multicultural teams, is that actually cultural intelligence is very malleable. There's research that shows it. So you aren't born with some innate cultural in-tuneness or anything like this. This is something that can be trained in people and teams. So I guess I put that out there because it's actually good news. If someone seems kind of stuck in this, they can learn. They can learn to be more culturally intelligent, and a team can learn to be more culturally intelligent. So there's four, when we talk about cultural intelligence, the traditional research on this is showing that there's four components to this. There's the metacognitive, so noticing assumptions and cultural cues. There's cognitive, understanding how cultures differ. There's motivational, so this is your interest and confidence in navigating differences, and behavioral, which is adapting behavior across cultures. Teams that have a higher CQ should spend less energy on friction and more energy on learning, innovation, and execution because their differences then become a resource. But as I said, a team might not have, they might have a diverse team and they're not acting as a culturally intelligent team. So if cultural intelligence gives us a framework for understanding our ability to work effectively across differences, um, then the next question for me is, well, what differences are we actually experiencing? So this right all here on the screen is quite theoretical. There actually are CQ assessments you can use, and no, I don't want to throw shade at them at all because I haven't tried them. I do know Finland is actually, ICF Finland is having a training on cultural intelligence. It was kind of coincidental that I did this one at the same time. But this is all very theoretical. But I actually, as the team coach, I want to talk about what differences are we experiencing with the team and how they could take those gaps and turn them into a resource, right? And, for me, I'm wondering, as a team coach, then how do we surface these discussions? So when I was like kind of pursuing this during a discovery phase, I had remembered Erin Meyer. She came and spoke at Nordic Business Forum. So I find that these conversations on these differences can be very easily formed around Erin Meyer's tool, the culture map. And her research and the tool provide a very practical way to explore how cultural differences show up in everyday workplace behaviors such as communication, feedback, decision making, and trust. So very briefly, what is it? It's a framework that maps cultural preferences across 8 dimensions, and I'll go into those later in the presentation. But vaguely, their communication style, feedback, hierarchy, trust, decision making, and time orientation. And these dimensions help to sort of decode or unpack how cultural differences are impacting collaboration in a team. If any of you are familiar with Hofstede's work, I'm only vaguely familiar, like I said, but Hofstede studied values, whereas Meyer looked at behaviors. So just so you understand, there is difference. And she did actually base her research off of Hofstede's as well as many others that came before her as well. So about the culture map, just like any assessments or psychometrics or personality tests, there are limitations. So it should be taken into context that this is just one way to look at behaviors. It is not the only way. Um, and actually, I'll jump down. There are some limitations of her work. It's based on business culture, and that, of course, skews global north. So it also then it treats entire nations as a monolith, but I'll get more into how she represents the data there. So it's a bell curve, like many of these personality tests are. But it's not accounting for regional differences or First Peoples experiences, Aboriginal experiences. It's really based on business culture. And again, it skews very global north. And there were not enough African nations represented in the data when I started looking into this. I and actually she did mention this. A lot of it was due to lack of, being able to get the data there. Um, but if I go into this, so it's not a judgment tool, it's a reflection tool. So it's to bring awareness into the complexity of the topic of cultural diversity and how it shows up in the workplace. So again, I have to stress that it's about workplace behaviors. The assessment does not place any value on a right way of behaving. It just simply sheds light into how culture is an influencing factor on our preferences and behaviors. Um, while you're while you're thinking of this, while you look at her, framework, if something doesn't land with you, that's absolutely okay. And I just want to say, for purposes of today, just consider it like a conversation and reflection tool rather than some sort of truth or boxing people into some identity. Um, Erin Meyer is a researcher and professor at INSEAD. So it's one of the largest international business schools. It's been backed by earlier research, like I said, into culture, but also in business and management as well. The data points are, like I was getting into earlier, the data points are averages of what is considered appropriate behavior for their culture. And again, appropriate is a big word there to use and a dangerous word to use, but um, it's validated because many people, if we think it's expectations, right? What you expect, how you expect someone would behave in the culture in your workplace, right? There are, of course, outliers in every country. So imagine that the data point you would see for Finland, for example, is actually a bell curve with a range of accepted behaviors and individual preferences. It was based on thousands of surveys completed. And I don't know if I have bullet point. No, I don't. Okay, sorry. It was based on thousands of surveys completed, and it was a free test at one point. I actually took it during when she had it free, and I think I took it as both. I tried it both as a Finn and an American, and then I kind of wanted to see how much, how I compared in both of these cultures, like where I differed from Finland, where I differed from the US. But it was free for a while, so she was collecting the data, and it was improved through feedback from leading executives from each of the nations that were represented in this. So again, take this again, that is it's also maybe a limitation here to mention is we're talking about office culture, and it doesn't necessarily cover blue collar, like industry manufacturing, what's going to happen on a front line or front, in on the lines kind of thing. It's, I'm just putting it out there that this is perhaps a limitation to kind of keep in mind. It might not be suitable for every type of global team you're working with, okay? And so it was improved through feedback from these leading executives from each nation. And yeah, already colored some of the limitations. They're not all the limitations, by the way, but some of them. So there's this question. Actually, she addresses this in her book. It's a great book, by the way. It's a very easy read, and lots of good gems in it, and lots of good stories to share. So shouldn't we just evaluate everyone on their uniqueness? Um, well, the culture map actually does look at folks as individuals, but it also provides context on the cultural biases that we all bring to the table in a global team. What I want to say is, I'm coming back to this, that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to diversity, and it revolves around this argument that, well, we're all humans, so we're all the same, and we should treat everyone the same. And to that, well, there's a big yes and to that statement. So yes, humans have physiological responses that make us all the same. We have feelings, pain, brain chemistry, etc. Um, but then cultural behaviors arise because of conditioning responses, and they shape the way in which we perceive the world. So some of them are cultural conditioning by choice, but in some populations, it's cultural conditioning because of oppression, because of war, because of occupation, these sort of things. So we have to bring this into the discussion here. Another point I want to put out is, and actually, Erin talks about this in her book, is that individualism is very widely a global north leaning concept. So there are many cultures in the world where there are very holistic views of self. Like I don't exist without everybody. And whereas in our cultures, we're taught from very early on that you have to be independent. It's not the same. So, um, I think that argument becomes problematic because it's assuming that everybody thinks of self and individualism as, the self and the individual as the same, and they do not. So some more on this topic. You should indeed begin relationships by understanding what is specific and unique to each individual. But you should also recognize and celebrate that culture influences the way we experience the world. And one thing to remember is that when you are deeply inside a culture, you don't see it. And what I mean by that, Erin gives a good example in her book, is that there's the story of two fish or three fishes. So two younger fish are going one way, and they are passing an older fish that's coming the other way. And the older fish says, "Hey, how's the water out over there?" And then they're swimming by, and then one of the younger ones says to the next one, "What the hell is water?" So I guess the point of that story really is that you don't maybe understand the water you're swimming in because you're swimming in it, right? Just like the fish, you're always swimming in it. So you don't see this difference. Whereas someone coming from the other side has experienced, oh, I understand there's water here now. Um, Maybe a different part of the ocean kind of thing that this older fish has come from. So very good. There's other types there's actually some Buddhist stories about this kind of, not seeing the water you're swimming in as well. So there's many such stories that exist. Why is this important? So I hope that's kind of clearing up a little bit, like, why, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, why why this is an important discussion to have, and that we shouldn't just evaluate we should and we shouldn't. So getting back to Meyer and the 8 dimensions of the culture map, she measured across dozens of cultures what people considered this appropriate workplace behavior in their culture. And here's a high-level overview of the 8 dimensions with a scale ranging from one extreme to another. So remember, there's kind of like a bell curve going on in between these. Um, so communicating, there's low context communication that's explicit, clear, and direct, and high context communication that's very nuanced and layered. In Japanese culture, they had this term of reading the air. So like, you're not even speaking something that Japanese folks can read from the air a lot of what's going on. Evaluating direct negative feedback is its feedback delivered clearly and honestly. It can be publicly delivered, and then there's indirect negative feedback. So feedback is delivered diplomatically and often wrapped in positive messages, and it's usually done in private. Leading is goes from egalitarian, so leadership is very collaborative and hierarchy is minimal, to hierarchical, where leadership is directive and hierarchy is respected. Deciding. So there's consensual where decisions are made collectively, often through group discussion and agreement, and then top-down decisions are made by somebody in authority with less group input. Trusting, we have task-based, which means trust is built through consistent performance and reliability in work-related tasks, and relationship building, relationship-based. So trust develops through personal connection, shared experience, and long-term relationship building. There's disagreeing. So from confrontational, where open disagreement is seen as constructive and wouldn't harm a relationship, to a culture that avoids confrontation. So disagreement is handled subtly to preserve harmony and the relationships in the team. Scheduling, there's linear time, so time is very structured, and you need to be here on this time when you say it. Um, to flexible time, that time is fluid and adaptable. So if I think about in Finland, a class starts at 8 a.m., but it actually doesn't. It starts at 8:15. You're supposed to somehow know that it doesn't start until 8:15. I didn't know that actually. So I had surprises the first time I walked into a Finnish classroom. And then persuading. Principles first, which the arguments begin with theoretical concepts or frameworks before moving to conclusions or practical applications, to applications first. Arguments would begin with practical examples or conclusions, with theory added as needed. And one thing to note is that in many non-Western cultures, persuasion may follow a holistic approach. So, more like integrating context, relationships, and intuition rather than separating these theory versus application. So, Erin notes that in a lot of the Asian cultures, this persuading bar, it disappears because it's a much different concept. It's more holistic, like she said. So here's how it looks like when you do the assessment. And for this is actually an actual example. So actually, this is not how it looks like for a team, but I put this together from a coaching standpoint so they could look at like these national averages of appropriate behavior in the workplace, like what's expected, this expected behavior. So I took the team and I mapped out these Finnish average or these national average points, and they could look at it from that way, like how is it expected in Ukrainian culture to how do we tell time? Actually, this linear, when I look at the scheduling one, I'm thinking of this specific team. The scheduling thing was actually a little bit of a friction point because, a lot of people thought the schedule was flexible, but the Finns were like, no, we start the meeting at 10 o'clock. So you could see that um, this can be interesting. This alone, without them doing their own individual assessments, this alone could provide some fun, interesting discussion and maybe some very heated discussions as well. So here we would see like when we think or when the team thinks that national differences are mattering in the team, you could look at it in this way. Here's the national averages, and you can ask questions about, questions might come up then, like how might Finnish directness land in a high context culture? How does hierarchy influence who speaks in meetings? Where might our time or trust preferences differ? So this supports the team in making invisible differences visible. And you can also actually think that this map is maybe even more um, useful for individual coaching because you can help a leader understand how their own behavior and cultural biases could be shaping how the team interacts, or maybe they're having trouble understanding an individual in the team, and so you could kind of help them see where there could be gaps. But you can also use this assessment, the culture map, for what I would call like a culture agnostic, national culture agnostic team use. So you could use these dimensions in the culture map and specifically think about team culture, organizational culture. It will ask questions still about nationality because she's still collecting data and always improving that. But you don't have to bring nationality into the discussion. You can just look at the team culture and look at how do we communicate as a team, direct or indirect. How do we decide? Are we consensus or authority driven? How do we handle disagreements? What pace do we work at? So you could use this in a very agnostic way to just look at the team culture, look at gaps in individuals in the team. Actually, here, I didn't explain this, but each of these dots is representing a person. So they took it, it's an individual, the whole team took it. This is not their nationality, this is a person in the team. So each of these people in the team, it shows where, there might be differences. There's, in some places there's, some extremes. Some places they're aligning in around certain things, and others, well, maybe there's a quite big spread, and even these spreads could cause quite a difference and friction in the team. So, you could use this as a way to explore the team culture independently of nationality. Now, that said, they can also take this discussion in terms of how their own cultural biases might be impacting the teamwork as a whole. So you can bring, especially in these global teams, you can bring this in once you've kind of covered the individuality aspects and the team itself, like us as the team. But you can also bring in this, how might their cultural biases be impacting the teamwork as a whole. So when to use the culture map. Um, so I think that the tool is especially valuable for global, hybrid, or cross-functional teams. And you could also apply it though if you just want to look into team culture and discuss around the workplace behaviors and individual preferences. So some examples. The team is having some miscommunication or misunderstandings. Decision making feels slow, unclear, or uneven. Some members are dominating the conversations while others are silent. Feedback is interpreted different. Feedback might be a really big thing, actually. Actually, feedback has been a big thing in every one of these teams I've worked with, regardless of whether it's t feedback in the team or feedback with stakeholders, actually. Trust building feels uneven, and there's tension around the pace, the deadlines, or time interpretation. Or, for example, the team is forming or reforming, and you're kind of looking for this, shared operating system. It can be one of these awareness tools where you start from if the team is new or reforming. So how can you use it in team coaching dialogues? Well, you can identify friction points. That's come up quite a lot here from my some of my examples. And what I want to point out with this is that even small differences in two individuals' preferences in one of these dimensions can lead to very big misunderstandings. And actually, Erin's book, she has many examples where two quite similar results ended up because it's in the nuance, right? And when you have those discussions, then it starts becoming clear why is the friction happening. Um, you can look at you could look at it to, again, like any assessment, look at the current state and then look at what would our ideal future. So maybe the team is wanting to improve their cultural intelligence. What areas do they need to do work in? And then co-creating team norms. So again, we got to find a way to collaborate, right? That kind of works for everyone or works the best it can for everyone. So having the discussions around how people's preferences differ and then how we can come together and make a norm on that is, you can use this tool for that kind of discussion. And then explore how team culture impacts stakeholder experience. So I did this with one of my teams as well, that they have um, customers that came from various they're a Finnish organization, and they had customers that were coming from very they had typical like national backgrounds they were working with their customers, and so they were kind of thinking like, well, how does our team culture look, and how does it shape the experiences we're giving for each of our customer identity groups? And yes, again, it's kind of they're kind of you're kind of stereotyping in a sense when you're thinking of that, but it's a good way for them to then be able to compare like how might our team biases be affecting or impacting what our customers need from us. And then understanding, again, just explore how team culture, explore what's happening in the system. It's, sometimes these conversations just need to be had, and understanding that there might be more in the team's wider system that's impacting their collaboration. I'm gonna actually stop